Hello, and welcome to this midday reading of, well, I was going to say, did I say midday? Midweek. And I was also a little bit off on, I was going to say reading of scripture, but we are going to do some read aloud. And I think I will leave getting back to the actual scripture where we left off until the morning. I did finally get back for a video, and it's been close to a week, actually. I did not intend for that, as usual. But I figured as I listened to the end of my video and some of the things that were bubbling up after reading the last chapter of 1 Samuel chapter 19, I wanted to kind of, follow up with that. And I had said that maybe we should delve into a little bit of, the question that I thought was probably going to be shared with others, God had this great protection on David, and why was that? And why, if you're familiar with much that's in the scripture and you've heard about David, you may have also heard that he was a man after God's own heart. And why was that the case about David specifically? Let's dive into that today with a reading of an article from, guess where? You got it. Got questions. All right. This is a site called Got Questions. Your questions, biblical answers. I really love this site. It's the question is, how could David be considered a man after God's own heart? Especially if you know about the life of David. Okay? And I say that because, he was not a perfect man. He was far from that. As far as, following what was right. Now, there's a lot of his life where he shows forth that he had a passion for God and that he did follow what was right. But alongside that, he did not always follow what was right. He had a very apparent, very, what's the word? Not apparent, maybe apparent, obvious, sinful side that he also followed after his own flesh, like, like humans do, but in ways that we may feel, oh, he's disqualified to be this man after God's own heart, So let's see why. To understand why David was a man after God's own heart, we need to see what characteristics he had to qualify for such an exalted description. In the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul speaks of God's feelings about King David. Quote, after removing Saul, he made David their king. He testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. Unquote, Acts 13:22. The answer to why David was considered a man after God's own heart is found right in the verse. David did whatever God wanted him to do. Okay, let's see how they qualify this. An obvious question is, how could God still call David a man after his own heart when David committed such terrible sins, including adultery and murder? So those are obviously things that God didn't want him to do, right? Because God had laws about that, for one, and he says that the law is good. And yeah. So we know what God's heart is. That's why he's fully backed by the law he gave us. Those are the things he considers good. We learn much of David's character in the book of Psalms as he opened up his life for all to examine. David's life was a portrait of success and failure, and the biblical record highlights the fact that David was far from perfect. But what made David a cut above the rest was that his heart was pointed toward God. Excuse me, I should have brought some water. Excuse me. Sometimes when I touch the screen, the scripture pops right up. I love that that feature that this site has. It's like very attached to all the scriptures that it references. So you can just look them right up. Okay, this video may end and then I'm going to be frustrated that it didn't record. So I think what I'll do